Welcome back to the podcast, Can Silicon Valley Solve Healthcare? The podcast where healthcare leaders talk about technology, technology leaders talk about healthcare, investors talk about impact, patients have a voice, and everyone has an opinion. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Can Silicon Valley Solve Healthcare, the podcast for people that are interested in innovation, talking to the innovators within healthcare, and also talking about I'm going to go back and do that all over again. We know healthcare is extremely hard, and we want to have an opportunity to talk to the people that are behind the innovations, the investors behind the innovations, and the customers of the innovations as well. But today I am thrilled to have a new friend of mine and a new friend of Syllable in the podcast, Ray Guzman, who is the CEO and co-founder of Switchpoint Ventures, join us today. Ray, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and certainly look forward to today's conversation.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for joining us. You're in Nashville, correct?
I am. I'm technically sitting in Franklin, Tennessee, which is a suburb of Nashville, but absolutely in the Nashville kind of healthcare ecosystem here.
Awesome. Actually, we dragged me out to Franklin a couple of weeks ago for a conference at a Marriott out there. I get confused between Franklin and Brentwood, but there's one coffee shop you guys all meet at, isn't there?
There is. It's a place called The Well. It's excellent coffee, but also what I love about the place is they actually take their profits and use that to fund fresh water wells across the world where there's a need for that kind of thing.
You know, and you told me that story because I met you for coffee at the Well, and I said before we met, I said, what is this? I'm always staying downtown and people are always inviting me out to the Well for coffee. And he said, Ray, I'll explain the story to you. And it's worth the trip just to feel good about the coffee. And you're right. They have really, really good coffee.
They do.
So again, thanks for joining us. I have, as I said in the introduction, I consider ourselves new friends, but I have so enjoyed the time that we have already spent together. I have found your insights to be incredibly helpful to me. And what I really love about you is your background. You have a bit of an atypical background for somebody in the healthcare technology space. And you have a career path that I think is, really something that is worth retelling, because as I mentor people of all sorts of backgrounds, they say, how do I get into healthcare? And, sometimes it doesn't really matter what your background is. If you have a passion for something and an interest in doing something, you find a way to make it happen. And as I look over your career arc, I kind of see that is something that you've done. You have an amazing background, and you've ended up in this space where you're now not only innovating in healthcare and healthcare technology, but you're also beginning to fund the next generation. So tell our audience a little bit about your journey and why someone like me finds it interesting and sort of what you've learned from it.
Sure. First, thank you for the kind words and just the interest in my story. It's been a bit of a windy road, and I guess if you look at the trajectory of it all, kind of 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2, right? It's like one door opens and another after another closes. I got my start in the military, had a really great 5-year experience in the Army, got my technology background there, got out of the military 2000 timeframe, which was the best time ever to get out of the military with a technical background, given the dot-com bubble and everything that was happening there. Did 2 startups and then landed at Microsoft. And it was there that I got really focused on healthcare. We had our second daughter at the time, and she was born premature and was in the NICU for several weeks. And it was that journey that made me realize I wanted to devote kind of the rest of my professional life to empowering those that care for patients. We ask them to do really, really difficult things, and it's getting increasingly complex from a regulatory compliance and frankly, just from a complexity perspective. And so, there's a small army of people that need to support those frontline caregivers, nurses, physicians, et cetera. And so just being a technologist, being kind of in the data space, I wanted to make sure that my contribution to our industry was going to be that of helping our clinicians do their best work with the best information possible.
And as you've moved through your career from somebody that plies his skills as a technologist to now becoming an investor. What is driving your passion around now investing in the space that you once worked in?
Yeah, great question. I guess after leaving Microsoft, I ended up joining a small consulting company called WPC Services at the time. Really cool little company. The year I joined, it had become the healthcare partner of the year for Microsoft. So, doing big things in the industry. And I ended up joining as a senior leader. One thing led to another, and I ended up becoming the CEO of that business unit. And it was really during that process that I came to appreciate how small but meaningful impact can have a cascading effect in the industry, right? So we had the privilege of having some really, really big customers. You can imagine who those folks, would be based here in the Nashville market. Yep. And we made the pivot at that point from consulting to AI. We were a little early. Our investors joked around we were too early, but it worked out.
What year are we talking about?
So this would have been circa 2010, 2011.
Okay.
So there was a lot of discussion about AI in healthcare. There were a lot of people saying they wanted to, do things, but we started building product based on what the market was telling us. And in the beginning, it was a bit of a slow adoption curve. But and life works out funny, right? A few years later, the market turns, and all of a sudden, you're well positioned for for the opportunity that's before you. We ended up exiting that company in 2017, and spent a year with our acquirer, which was a THC portfolio company that was subsequently acquired while we were there by a public company out of Chicago, R1. So it was a real interesting period of time, 2 transactions in 15 months, wow. And we left to start Switchpoint. To answer your question, our model is a little bit different. So the term venture studio is getting pretty hot these days, and there are some different models around that. Some of them do have funding arms attached to them where they will build things, and then the funding mechanism, if you will, comes to that NewCo. Our model has not been that to date. We are a little different in that we take advantage of our access to the market to learn and discover where all the kind of pain is in the industry, and then we will kind of determine how we think AI can come to the table to solve for the pain. Where we are a little different, I think, is one, we don't build anything without having kind of that partner in tow. And then so secondarily, we don't actually put capital into the businesses. What we'll do is we'll build out the kind of MVP, the 1.0, deploy it, get an ROI, kind of have a case study or a use case. And then at that point, we'll spin that concept into a NewCo, and we'll raise capital into the NewCo.
Got it.
That capital is then used to hire a management team, and then they go scale the business. So that's our model. It's built on a lot of conversations with industry leaders. When you hear of a problem that seems important, it's really important that you don't build to an N of one, right? You've got to make sure it's industry pervasive. And so we spend a lot of energy talking to other healthcare leaders, validating the thesis, validating that the pain that we're hearing about is pervasive. And if you can figure that out and it all checks out, then you've got a real opportunity to build something special.
What was it that was attractive to you about that kind of model? Because I think with your background, you probably could have gone to work for a traditional VC and gone out to do that kind of work. But what was it about the sort of the studio concept that was attractive to you? Yeah,
potentially, right there. I have as you pointed out, a non-traditional background. So maybe the VC route would have been open for me, maybe not. I don't have the traditional, 4-year college degree or the advanced degree. I've got some experience that I think would have, potentially been interesting to some traditional venture firms. But there's a different road going down that path than the one that I've been on. To answer your question, disruption was really interesting to me. My experience has been, I'll give you an example. After we got acquired, I ended up as a very senior position reporting to the CEO of a large company. And I loved it because the first 6 months of that tenure, they had me as the head of strategy, which is actually my natural gifting. It's the thing I love to do the most. 6 months into it, an operating role opened up, and they asked me to step into that role. And so what I quickly realized, and I actually went to a mentor and kind of had this discussion, frankly, out of frustration, as head of strategy, in a weird way, you're kind of trying to figure out what to break, right, in the existing model. So, your unofficial kind of mandate is go break things, but carefully, right? Well, if you think about being, a senior leader with a P&L responsibility and, a few hundred people on your team and that kind of thing, you actually design your work structures for nothing to break. You want to keep the trains leaving on time, et cetera. Right. And so I was having a really hard time because, and I told a mentor, I said, I feel like I'm driving a car with my foot on the gas and the brake at the same time. If there's a whole lot of noise, there's smoke everywhere, all the meters are, up and to the right, RPM, the whole deal, and we're not going anywhere, right? And so it was a real lesson for me around the idea that innovation from within is really, really hard because the structures that exist, frankly, prohibit it. There are a handful of companies that do it well, but it's really, really hard otherwise. And so it kind of gave us the idea that we needed to be the partner that could help tease out that innovation from within and actually execute against it without disrupting how these large companies worked. And so there was to answer your question, there were just a number of things like that became lessons for us around how do we do what we do most effectively with large companies as partners in a motion, if you will, that works for both of us. I mean, the other side of that is also, we wanted to bet on ourselves. And so a model where we take all the risk of building up a product and proving it out, has a really high upside to it financially if you can execute and scale, right, because you end up with a lot of equity in that company. And so in a weird way, it was a really big bet on ourselves. And so far, it's been a really cool experience. We're just about at 5 years as a studio. We've got several companies in market and a lot of interest in what we're doing. And so it's been a fun ride. And I think that equity bet is going to prove out, pretty well for us.
Gosh, we could go in so many directions, and we could talk for a lot longer than 30 or 45 minutes on this. But I'm curious, is it hard letting go? I mean, it almost seems like you're birthing a baby and then raising it to a certain degree, and then you're sort of pushing it out the door and saying, "Okay, good luck and Godspeed." Now, you have equity in the company, so you're probably not far away from it, but you're not involved in it sounds like you're not involved in the day-to-day operations at a certain point. So, is it hard to separate?
It's a really great and insightful question. Short answer, yes. And if you think about kind of punting the value of what you've created into kind of the equity structure and patiently waiting, with these companies being so early stage, oftentimes some of these decisions feel really binary, right? A good decision, company's on a good path, bad decision, maybe you don't have a company anymore, right? Or you certainly have something to recover from. So the studio supports these companies. So we've got folks on the team that support them from a operations and finance and legal and marketing perspective, and they're more involved, on a hands-on way in a more day-to-day basis. I'm less involved. I would say, I'm on the board of the companies that we've spun out, but I think my primary job beyond just kind of my natural strategy work with the companies is I'm kind of the CEO coach. And to answer your question, it's hard, right? Because having done this a few times, you will often see a fork in the road and the answer, where you need to go, but you can't scale telling people that. So what I've had to learn to do is become a really good coach, ask really good questions, and try to help our portfolio company CEOs kind of arrive at the best decision possible for the company. And that takes a little more time. It could be a longer process, but it's certainly, I think, a lot more fruitful for both the company, the CEO, and frankly, for me, I'm learning a new skill, which is, influence through question asking and, having good insights that I can tease out to help the company get to the right decision.
I'm curious, in your CEO coaching, what are some common themes that you see that you need to coach these founders and the CEOs through?
Yeah, they're all the kind of normal business things, and I suspect your audience probably has heard a lot of those. So I'm going to put those to the side and just kind of assume that people know those. Adam, I think the biggest thing is learning to control kind of the emotion behind it. The highs are really, really high and the lows are really, really low. And especially when you're super early stage, it feels like every threat is existential to the company, right? And so, I've often told the Portco CEOs, if you see me not reacting in the way that you would expect from an emotional perspective, it's not that I don't see the risk or that I don't understand, why there should be some concern. It's just the experience, right? All this gray hair that is now emerging tells me, like, I understand where we are. I know the path. Like, let's work through it together. And so, I had one of the Portco CEOs said to me the other day, it's scary how well he's gotten at compartmentalizing, because you have to do that. So I find that, look, we hire really smart, capable people. And so I could, give you the spiel about, know your per unit economics and understand your burn rate. Like, but I suspect your audience knows all that. I think my best answer that might be a little unique to, to people that are listening is the emotional side of it. There's a real human dynamic here. You're still dealing with people, no matter how exciting or difficult the challenges might be. Containing those emotions, thinking through things critically, and making the best decision, primarily unemotionally. I think it's one of the things that people don't talk about a lot. That is really, really important to the process.
I want to transition the discussion a little bit. You started with AI in the 2010s, and Syllable is an AI company, started in 2016, and something's changed. In the last 6 months, it's longer than that, but from the media standpoint, it's really in the last 6 months, and that's ChatGPT. I mean, people are, the moniker of AI is sort of like last year's news, even though it still is AI. Everybody's talking about ChatGPT. So I'm curious, from your standpoint, what do you make of all the hype? Is this real? Is it just a media moment? And then I have some sub questions about how healthcare is going to deal with it. But I'm just curious about how you view ChatGPT at this point in time and what its impact might be.
No, it's a great question, Adam. And ChatGPT, in a way, has been the best and worst thing that's ever happened to kind of our business, right? The worst, because as you might imagine, I've received approximately 593,000 questions about it.
This is 594,000, right?
You got it. At the same time, I think it's made AI feel real to people, right? And what's interesting about that is it's all around us. You pick up your phone and it's already presuming it knows where you want to go, and the map's already offering you, hey, are you headed here? Click here, right? You open, Amazon, and they're using AI to figure out what to present to you. Netflix, you name it. It surrounds our daily lives, but it's so almost imperceptible that people just haven't really realized how much they're being affected by it. And so for the first time with ChatGPT, it feels like it became really accessible to the masses. And because of the kind of large language model kind of capabilities, so the ability to kind of string together coherent sentences to people, it's really powerful, right? And so what's interesting about the technology itself, as you've played around with it, is it's often wrong, right? It's confident in its wrongness, right? But just the idea that capability even exists has really gotten people's attention. And so I think for the first time, you have boardrooms asking in earnest, hey, what is our response to this? What are we going to do? What are our competitors going to do? Where is the market? Where is our opportunity? What kind of risks do these present to us? And so in that sense, it's been a real blessing, because some of the things that we've built or in the process of building, all of a sudden, where there might have been some skepticism about AI, now all of a sudden people are embracing it. Well, I didn't answer the second part of your question. So what do I make out of it, and is it real? I think it's quite real. What does the future hold for it? I don't think anyone knows. There are a lot of talking heads, prognosticating about where we're going to be. I would say, when our parents were growing up, they thought we'd be living in the Jetson age, and we're not. There's some things that are kind of like that, but we're far away from that. And so I'm not here to tell you 10 years from now it's going to look like this or like that. What I would say is what's interesting and maybe perhaps concerning is the velocity behind what's happening. And so it feels like those cycles are condensing, getting faster. So we're leapfrogging faster than ever before. And so that's the part that makes it, I think, really difficult to kind of project where are we going to be in 5 or 10 years. I don't know the answer to that question. What I will tell you is I think from an efficiency and workflow and automation perspective, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that's absolutely going to get disrupted.
So I was really bullish on AI's ability to provide automation in healthcare, especially on the administrative side. Because we doctors we don't like having somebody sit over our shoulder and tell us what the next best action is.
I've learned that.
Yes, you have, and that's why I'm going to ask you this question. How do you view healthcare's adoption of the tools that are inevitably going to come out of ChatGPT? Is this are they going to do what they usually do, which is wait 10 years and wait and see what everybody else does and then be a late adopter, or are you a little bit more bullish and think that this is the adoption's already been very quick. The ramp to 1 billion users has been quicker than any other technology. Do you think healthcare will eventually open up more quickly than usual?
I do, and I don't think it's going to be quite 10 years. I think the example I would give you, and this is a little bit different, but I think you'll get the point here. Yeah, I remember when the iPhone came out, and every healthcare company I knew of had the App Store or the iTunes blocked, right? Because it was a consumer thing and all these security things. And so we didn't have this notion of like bring your own device to work in the healthcare world. You saw it in other industries, but not healthcare. And I won't name names, but I'll just say there was a very large health system, and I remember because I was there when it happened. The CEO went and got an iPhone, and so sure enough, his iPhone wasn't working. So he went to the head of security, CISO, and basically said, "Hey, I need this to work." And so what they do, they poked a hole in the firewall and created a way to make it work. And before you knew it, there were iPhones everywhere. And so something that we would have said, no way, from a security and a posture perspective, would ever happen, because it was kind of a consumerized thing first. And these leaders are still consumers, and the CEO of this very large health system wanted his phone to work inside the four walls of their corporate headquarters.
Right.
It happened like that, right? So I would have told you 5 years max or minimum, and all of a sudden it was 5 days after he got his phone. Right. I think I give that story to share that I think from a ChatGPT perspective, because so many of us are experiencing it from a consumer perspective first, we're already ideating about how we could use it in healthcare. Not to pick on Apple, I'm an ex-Microsoft guy, so it's a little weird to still talk about Apple so much. Great company, love all their products, by the way. Doing this on a MacBook as we speak. One of the things, if you remember the iPad commercials, Apple never told you how to use it.
Right.
They showed you people using it, and they showed you tons of use cases, but they never actually told you what it was for or how to use it. They left it to kind of your own imagination. And so I think this is going to happen with ChatGPT as well. We're already having people approach us with different ideas. And so I could see scenarios where, we talked a little bit about some of the responses being very confident but wrong.
Yep.
I foresee scenarios where, health systems are going to say, hey, look, we trust these 20 or 30 data sources. And you could pick, what they are, New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, whatever. And so it might be interesting to have ChatGPT listen in and kind of drive a little bit based on the data sources that we've curated that we have a high degree of confidence in. And that doesn't mean it's going to be right every time, because it's still, a machine doing this.
Right.
But I think the starting point is going to be from a source of kind of trust or truth where the clinicians are at least going to be receptive to that. So I see all sorts of use cases where people are going to pop up and build businesses that maybe help you curate those data sources, and then come alongside you in your EMR or some other kind of medium and deliver some value there. What you're really talking about, Adam, and maybe I'll just go into a little bit of a spiel here about AI and how this works. People always want to talk about the accuracy of models, right? You should always assume that you shouldn't deploy something that isn't reasonably accurate, right? Depending on what you're trying to solve for, that accuracy might vary a little bit. But if it's not going to move the needle, there's no value, right? The thing people kind of underappreciate and don't really think a lot about is what we call the utility of those models. And so you can't escape. You have to think about how people are going to consume this, what's the workflow, et cetera. So just to give you like a real example, if I could tell you the closing price of Chipotle stock today, that would be amazing information, right? It's probably 2 hours before the market closes right now. You could do a lot with that. But if I could tell you that only 2 seconds before the market closes, it just went from being really amazing to just being an interesting kind of thing, right?
Right.
And so that's an example of kind of the utility here. So when we think about models and kind of how AI can come in and serve, kind of our healthcare brethren and what they do, we have to think a lot about how do we do this in a way that's not disruptive to how they already do things? What's the right workflow? If you're doing something that's, monitoring risk or something, how many alerts is a reasonable number? What's the threshold there before you throw an alert?
Right.
We are in the middle of building out a kind of a urology-based clinical care pathway platform right now. And look, we're still at a point where, my COO and I flew out to, the urology place and spent, some time and, learned more about urology than I ever thought I'd want to. but you can't understand the utility aspect of that unless you sit with those that are going to end up using the application. And so I think that's really critical to the future here. So it's not just the AI, it's how do you complement that almost from a behavioral science perspective to make sure that there's going to be adoption of what you've built.
Yeah, I agree. The chair time or the co-pilot time of sitting alongside the people that are doing those jobs that you're trying to bring the innovation to is so important because, I mean, Silicon Valley writ large, just using it as a model for innovation anywhere, is full of entrepreneurs that have great ideas, but are short on experience within the particular sector that they're in. And so, I think that's a really insightful comment. And what I struggle with sometimes is how do you go to a prospective customer and share that? What is and what's going to resonate with them? Because at Syllable, we very early on we went into the call center for our large alpha client, and we basically pitched a tent in front of their hospitals for about 6 months and walked the halls and sat with the call center employees and talked to nurses, talked to doctors, talked to people in the cafeteria, just to get an understanding, to your point, of what the pain points are, but also to understand the utility of whatever it is that we might develop and then deploy.
Yeah, that's right. And I don't want to gloss over that because it's hard. Even with what we do, we've done this many times over, and it's hard. It's not a trivial thing to do when you're asking people to potentially do something differently. Two thoughts there. The first one is just from experience. We know you mentioned kind of Silicon Valley building things and then trying to convince people. That's not our model. Maybe it's just we don't have the hubris to think we know how to fix healthcare. We think guys like you know how to fix healthcare, the clinicians, the folks that actually deal with patients that are on the front line every day. And so we source our ideas from, frankly, our network. So kind of differentiator number one is these aren't our ideas that we're bringing to the market and trying to convince. These are essentially pain points that we turn into ideas that we're taking back to the market based on what the market has told us. So that's one kind of thing I want to kind of point out. The second thing I'd say is, look, I'll give you two examples, two of our portfolio companies. One of them is called Winnow. What we're doing with Winnow is we're helping recruiters, primarily health systems and hospital-based medicine folks, predict who their ideal targets should be for a given role. And it's an interesting solution. We're predicting who's likely to be thinking about changing jobs. We're thinking about timing and where are you recruiting them to? Based on their history, they look like they'd be receptive to your organization. But the last piece of it, which is really the unlock, is we're telling you that, hey, Dr. Brown looks to be an amazing fit for you based on these other predictions. And by the way, he's connected to Dr. Silverman, who you already employ. And so when you survey clinicians, 90% of them will tell you, I took this job I'm in now because somebody I personally knew told me about it. Somebody I knew recruited me into the role. Somebody I knew is here. And so if we know that's the unlock, why wouldn't we build a whole process around that? And so we built this thing based on all the feedback. Everyone said, yes, this would work. This is amazing. Do it. Then we started winning a bunch of deals when we go to deploy and implement. And it took a while because we started learning organizationally, everyone's structured a little differently. There are some large health systems out there where the recruiters literally don't talk to the doctors. And so all of a sudden, this unlock that you've just created, which is helping you understand those relationships between your current clinicians and your prospective hires, isn't unlocked anymore. And so we've had to work with some organizations to say, hey, can we think about how you're doing this a little differently? Can we work with you to think about incentives and alignment? And how do we create a pathway for you to be able to use this last mile of the technology, which is frankly where I think 90% of the value is. So even experienced guys like ourselves who've done this, many times over, you still run into those things. I think the best course of action, Adam, is just having candid conversations.
Yeah.
My experience has been large organizations don't expect early stage companies to have it completely together. The mistake I think early stage companies make is that they're presenting themselves that way. And once you do that, you're setting the bar there and you're going to fall short. You just haven't had the time in market. You don't have enough use cases. You probably haven't raised enough money to have that level of maturity to be there out of the gate. But what you'll find is these companies are looking for ways to improve, ways to do things better. And so for me, it's as much about telling them the journey that we're on and the one we're on together as it is
Right.
about trying to position yourself as perfect. And so when you do it that way, probably a long-winded answer to your question, when you do it that way, it gives you license to go in and say, hey, this is working really well. This is not. Here are some of the challenges that, we see. Can we talk about the structure? Can we talk about the incentives? Can we talk about the behavior? Because guess what? You might as well have that conversation because they're sure as heck going to be telling you that about your product.
Right.
So you might as well have a bi-directional conversation. But look, at the end, what does everybody want? Everybody wants this to be successful for you and them. So as long as you're working in that spirit, you can get past some of the implementation challenges. They're going to be there. Organizations are inherently resistant to change. Like we talked about earlier in the discussion, we design structures so things don't break. And so if you're coming in essentially breaking how something works, there's going to be resistance. Right. It's all about alignment after that.
A friend of mine, a former McKinsey consultant and healthcare lead, describes it as earning the right to do whatever. So it's earning the right to do the POC, earning the right to get to the next stage, earning the right to sign the first contract, earning the right to expand into other use cases. And it sounded so simple to me when he said it, but now 4 years into this, it makes so much sense. It is relationship based, it is trust based, and it's work. Nobody ever signs on the dotted line without putting you through your paces and making it work. Maybe at some point in time you become the category killer, and you're the Microsoft or the Google or the Facebook or the Amazon, and they just sign it and give you the credit card. But until you get to that point, it's a lot of work.
Yeah, I would say the trusting is spot on, and I'd say even with relationship, trust is still earned.
Yeah.
And so one of the things, just keep using Window as the example, since I mentioned it earlier. In the beginning when we started deploying this with customers, there are all sorts of gaps with the product. Software is never done, right? There are always going to be things that you need to be working on. But what really I think won our customers over and won the market over is our ability to execute. So when you lay out your roadmap and you say, this is where we're headed, and they see month after month that you're actually executing on what you said you were going to deliver, when they come up to you with a new problem and say, hey, the product, have you thought about doing this? Or we would think it'd be really valuable if you could do this. If you say to them, hey, that makes sense, that's on our roadmap, we can pull it forward and we'll have it in 2 months. Normally people are skeptical about that, right? Because they hear promises all the time. But when you've proven over and over again, month after month, with these updated releases that you're delivering on the roadmap that you committed, there's a really high degree of confidence that the very thing they're asking you about that you're now committing to, they believe it's going to happen because they've seen it happen for months on end. And so it lets you elevate the conversation a little differently. And so instead of them trying to hold you accountable to make sure you actually do it, you can then instead have a conversation about what it is they're asking you to do, what the drivers are, the depth of the problem, the scope of the problem, et cetera, and actually get smarter about what it is you're going to build in response to their request. So it's earned.
It is. Absolutely. I want to talk about Nashville for a minute. So yeah. I kind of naively entitled this podcast, Can Silicon Valley Solve Healthcare? But innovation in healthcare is occurring elsewhere in the country. And your friend and mine, Tran, introduced us, and he's introduced me to an entire network of people in Nashville that are entrepreneurs and are celebrated entrepreneurs and celebrate as entrepreneurs. What is it about the Nashville ecosystem that makes it friendly, and sort of what is going on there that's enabling you and your partners to have success?
Yeah, it's a great question. Nashville is a special place. It's, I'm thinking about your question, and the first thing that popped into my head was HCA, right? So there's this thing called a family tree that's published by the Nashville Healthcare Council. And it really just shows kind of HCA at the center and all of the things that kind of were spawned out of that, either directly or indirectly. So it didn't mean that HCA necessarily created something. It might mean you were an early exec, you did really well financially. Maybe you decided to start your own health system or your own services company to support a health system or whatever the case might be. And over the last, almost 50 years, this family tree, it's literally the size of a poster. And so I think kind of the culture, the ethos of an HCA has a really large kind of imprint on how people in kind of Nashville healthcare think about collaboration, think about supporting each other. I would say the tech kind of awakening is a little bit newer, probably in the last 10 years. probably the last 6 or 7 in earnest. And so that wasn't always the case, but what you're finding is the Nashville community tries to support, entrepreneurs, period. Nashville entrepreneurs, yes, but it's not, there's no blocking happening for, companies that are not based here. If you're doing a meaningful amount of business here, I think in general, people want to see you make an investment in Nashville, have an office, have some local employees, et cetera. But at the end of the day, I think the underlying kind of ethos of the Nashville healthcare ecosystem is we want to make this thing better. None of us can do it alone, even somebody the size and scale of an HCA. And so how do we collaborate in such a way where we can still be competitive, we can still try to grow our respective businesses, but do it in a way where we all win? Because if we win, ultimately who's winning are the patients that, walk through the doors, of your hospital, or the members that are, part of your health plan, or, whatever the context might be.
I ask every person that joins the podcast about their feelings about the following question. And you shared your experience up front with your daughter being born and the challenges that you had with that. But is healthcare fundamentally broken?
That's a really good question. And like most good answers, the answer is yes and no. I think about it through 2 lenses, and maybe a little shout out here to the Nashville Healthcare Council Fellows Program. I went through the program in 2017. And this is one of the things that, you kind of explore, and they present to you different models, right? So you learn about, healthcare in, England or the UK. You learn about healthcare in Singapore. You compare, you contrast, Canada, other countries. And so kind of just my instinctive answer is, look, there are a lot of challenges here, but by and large, if you have the resources and you're not well, people come here. They come to America for their care, right? And there's a reason for that. And it's not that we have it perfect, but we have, an advanced system that embraces innovation, that typically has cutting edge technology that can help you address whatever it is you might have going on. And so through that lens, no, look, the innovation's there, the outcomes are, there's some room for improvement, but, by and large, people come here for a reason. Now, the second part of that answer is, yeah, look, it's the only industry that I'm aware of where the end kind of customer doesn't really understand the economics behind the industry. And so that can, I guess, for lack of a better word, pervert the model a little bit where, people don't understand. So I remember 10, 12 years ago, I would ask people, do you know what your last healthcare encounter costs? And people would tell me very quickly, $20. And I said, no, not your copay. What did it actually cost to deliver care to you? And I could think of maybe 2 or 3 times where somebody actually knew the number. And then you start asking them more questions, and they were kind of early into the high deductible plans where, they had an incentive to care. So I think there are a lot of things like that we're going to have to figure out. And we're starting to get there. How do we treat patients as consumers? Because guess what? They are consumers, and increasingly they're having choice, right? All of a sudden, healthcare is not necessarily bound within the 4 walls of your hospital or even your market. I can take out my iPhone and talk to a specialist, in a minute, right? And so we've got to think about healthcare a little differently. How do we align incentives? How do we make sure that the reimbursement models are still supportive of innovation? Because that's ultimately what we want, yet making sure that kind of all of us can benefit from that. How do we make sure people don't get priced out? When you look at the American kind of dollar being spent in healthcare, you look at, say, other countries, they just tend to spend a lot of money on kind of social services, and I'll call it wellness. But if you put kind of those 2 pies together, because people are quick to point out kind of our per capita spend on healthcare. But if you put those 2 buckets together for, the U.S. and other countries, you're going to find they're spending about what we are, except the emphasis is on health and wellness and kind of avoiding some of the things that we're just now talking about, like social determinants of health, and the like. And so it's a real question, I think, for this country, which is just to say, where do we want to spend our dollars? We know the outcomes we want. There's kind of 2 ways to get there, right? We can help people avoid poor health and spend the dollars up front. And that includes things that, maybe politically I wasn't a huge fan of earlier in my life. And all of a sudden I think a lot about, safety nets and closing gaps in care and social determinants, et cetera. So do we want to emphasize that and put our dollars there and avoid these outcomes? Or do we want to wait until people have these blow-ups and show up in your ED and pay for it that way? The truth of the matter is, if you walk into an ED and need care, whether you can pay for it or not, or have insurance or not, you're going to get treated. And so we're paying for it. We just seem to not want to admit it.
A lot of things to unpack there. We're going to bring you back, I think, another time to go through a lot of that. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's there's the saying that your zip code is a greater determinant of your health outcomes than your genetic code, and you're right. The European countries with robust safety nets invest on the social side and less on the medical side, and we flip it. And you're absolutely right. The total amount spent is the same. The outcomes are probably a little bit different, but
yeah, we've politicized it, and we got to figure out how to separate that from the conversation.
Exactly.
To have an honest conversation.
Honest conversations. They're so easy to come by these days. We're coming to the end of our time, but just one last question for you. So you're sitting at the well having, a cup of your favorite pour over, and some young guy or young gal comes over and says, "Hey, Mr. Guzman, you've been successful, and I'm really interested in becoming an entrepreneur and having a career that is similar to yours." What kind of advice do you have for somebody like that?
I think the first question I'd have for them is just kind of an honest conversation about risk tolerance. I'd probably talk to them a little bit about the journey they're getting ready to go through. One of my frustrations, I tell people all the time, I'm not a writer, I'm not an author, but if I had a book in me, it might be, entrepreneurism in real life. Because, when people kind of become really, really successful, you hear their story and it often sounds like, I had an idea, I wrote some code, I went and took a shower, I came back, I had $4 million in sales. And so I decided to raise $1 billion and now I'm publicly traded. And it's just like, okay, that might happen like 1 out of 1 billion. That's not how it works for everyone else. But we kind of glamorize this in such a way that I think people perceive that that's how it can work.
Yeah.
And that's not to say there aren't some fast successes out there, but it's just not very common. And so it's not that I would want to dissuade anybody, but I would want to have a conversation with them about how things are likely to go, and just kind of walk them through that process. I think things that are important, what are you solving for? Like, what value will you create? Why would your company need to or deserve to exist? My wife and I were talking about this the other day. Do you have a community around you that's, can support you? And that's personal and professionally. I've benefited tremendously from mentorship. I think it's a really important component here because you're going to have, some hard days. When I got my first CEO gig, there were days where I would drive to the office and I would think to myself, like, this is a perfect job for me. Nobody's better suited to do this job at this point in time for this company right here, right now than me. And I promise you, 2 hours later, I'd be sitting at my desk and going, God, if they knew all the things I didn't know, they'd walk me out of the door right now. And so I called a friend and he said, hey, come meet me for coffee. And ironically, it was at the well. And so we met up, and I won't say who it is, but let's just say this guy ran a $6 billion division of a very, very large company. And he starts describing the same kind of imposter syndrome to me.
Yeah.
And I'm aware of it, but for me, I'm looking at him going, well, you've been a CEO of $1 billion company and a $2 billion and $4 billion and now a $6 billion. And so, you can do this. You've got this amazing track record. He said, hey man, like, I still have the same doubts as everyone else. And so it was just really helpful to have somebody I could call that I knew had that experience that could just talk me off the ledge a little bit. Yeah. I shared my frustration about the analogy about driving in the car with the foot on the gas and the brake. I called the mentor, about that, and just out of frustration. And he reminded me, he said, hey, a good strategist is thinking 3 years and out. A great operator is thinking 12 months and in. A good operator is thinking 3 months and in. And so he said, I want you to think about that. At the starting block, you have a 2-year gap you've got to overcome. And that assumes you're surrounded by great operators. And so that really helped me think about what I was trying to do as a strategist for this, company differently, back then. And so just having those folks that you can call, get that feedback from, and just surround yourself with people that are truly invested in your success, want to see you win, and will help you get there.
Awesome. Well, there's so much more that we could talk about, and I would love to, but Ray Guzman, CEO and co-founder of Switchpoint Ventures, thanks for spending time on the podcast with us.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to listening to the rest of the podcasts that you produce over the next few months and years here.
Awesome. And look forward to having coffee with you at the well again.
I'll see you there.
All right. Thanks so much.